The lighthouse keeper's daughter was born knowing she would never leave the island. Though no one had told her this in words, it was simply understood, the way certain truths settle into your bones before your mind can form questions about them. Her name was Elena, and on the morning of her 7th birthday she woke to find her mother standing at the kitchen window, staring out at the grey expanse of ocean with an expression that seemed carved from the same stone as the cliffs below their cottage. "Mama," Elena said softly, but her mother didn't turn, didn't blink, didn't acknowledge the word at all. She simply stood there motionless as the lighthouse itself, her hands resting on the windowsill, her gaze fixed on something far beyond the horizon, or perhaps on nothing at all, on an absence so complete it had become its own kind of presence. Elena's father found her there an hour later, still watching her mother watch the sea. He placed a hand on Elena's shoulder, his calloused fingers gentle despite their roughness, and said in a voice barely above a whisper, "She's waiting again. Best leave her be." But Elena, who had inherited her mother's stubbornness, along with her dark eyes and the way her hair curled in the salt air, asked the question she had been holding back for as long as she could remember. What is she waiting for? Her father's face did something complicated then, a movement of muscles that was part grimace and part resignation, and he spoke words that would echo through Elena's life like the steady pulse of the lighthouse beam cutting through fog. "She's waiting for your brother to come home from the sea." Before we continue, if you'd like to join me for more stories like this, feel free to subscribe. I share a new one every day. And, if you don't mind, leave a comment and tell me where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I love seeing how far these stories travel. The island was called St. Kilda's Mark, though no one could quite remember which saint or which Kilda had given it that name, or what mark was meant to be commemorated there. It rose from the North Atlantic like a fist of rock thrust upward by some ancient geological fury, its cliffs sheer and forbidding, its interior a treeless expanse of heath and stone. 37 families lived there, scattered across the southern slope where the land was marginally less hostile, where gardens could be coaxed into grudging productivity, and where the wind, though never gentle, was at least not actively murderous. The lighthouse stood at the island's highest point, a white tower that had marked these dangerous waters for 3 generations. Elena's grandfather had been its first keeper, her father its second, and it was understood without discussion that someday, if the pattern held, the responsibility would pass to Elena herself, though this was complicated by the fact that she was a girl, and lighthouse keeping was considered men's work, and the bureaucrats on the mainland had opinions about such things. But that was a problem for the future. In the present, Elena was 7 years old, and trying to understand why her mother spent so many hours standing at windows, or walking the cliff paths, or sitting on the rocks above the harbor, always looking out, always waiting, for a brother Elena had never known existed until that morning. Her father explained it to her later that day. In the lighthouse keeper's cottage, where the walls were thick stone, and the windows were small against the wind, they sat at the kitchen table, and he poured himself tea that had gone cold while he searched for the right words. "You had a brother," he said finally. "Michael, he was 10 years older than you, a fine boy, smart and strong, with a way about him that made people smile. He wanted to go to sea, wanted to join the merchant marine and see the world beyond this rock. Your mother didn't want him to go. She had dreams about it, bad dreams that woke her crying in the night. But Michael was 17, and 17-year-old boys don't listen to their mother's dreams, even when their mothers have the sight. Elena knew about the sight, though she didn't fully understand it. The sight was something some of the island women claimed to have, an ability to know things before they happened, to sense the shapes of future events in the way water dripped from a candle or the pattern of tea leaves at the bottom of a cup. Her mother had never spoken of it, but the other women whispered about it when they thought Elena couldn't hear. "He left on a supply ship," her father continued, his voice steady but his eyes distant with remembering. "Said he'd write from every port, said he'd come back rich with stories and gifts from distant lands. Your mother stood on the dock and watched the ship disappear over the horizon, and she never stopped watching." "Not really." "That was 10 years ago, Elena. 10 years, and not a word, not a letter, not a sign that he lived or died, or remembers he has a mother who waits." Elena absorbed this information slowly, the way a piece of cloth absorbs water gradually, completely, until it becomes heavy with the weight of it. "But why does she still wait?" she asked. "If it's been 10 years. "Because she's his mother," her father said simply, as if this explained everything, and perhaps, in its way, it did. The days on St. Kilda's Mark followed rhythms as old and predictable as the tides themselves. Elena's father tended the lighthouse, climbing the spiral stairs each evening at dusk to light the lamp, adjusting the clockwork mechanism that rotated the lens, ensuring that the beam swept across the dark waters with metronomic precision. Elena's mother, on the days when she was present in more than just body tended, the garden mended, clothes cooked meals, and performed all the ordinary tasks of maintaining a household on a remote island where nothing came easy and everything required careful husbanding of resources. But increasingly, she spent her time waiting, not actively, not with obvious distress, but with a patience that was somehow more unsettling than grief would have been. She would simply stop whatever she was doing and drift to a window, or out the door, or down to the cliffs. And there she would stand, scanning the horizon with an attention so intense it seemed she might will ships into existence, through sheer force of expectation. Elena learned to navigate around these absences, these moments when her mother was physically present, but mentally elsewhere. She learned to prepare simple meals for herself, to mend her own torn stockings, to braid her own hair in the mornings. She learned to check on her mother periodically, making sure she hadn't ventured too close to the cliff edge in her distraction, hadn't forgotten to eat or sleep or come in from the rain. She also learned about the other women on the island who waited. There was Mrs. Calloway, whose husband had gone to the mainland for medicine 3 years prior and never returned. She sat by her window each afternoon, a chair positioned for optimal viewing of the harbor, her knitting needles moving with mechanical precision while her eyes remained fixed on the sea. There was young Mary Duncan, barely 20, whose sweetheart had enlisted in the Navy and whose letters had stopped coming after he was posted to the Far East. She walked the beach each morning before dawn, searching the tide line as if messages in bottles might wash ashore to explain his silence. There was old Mrs. Macpherson, who had been waiting for her son to return from the fishing banks for 15 years, though everyone else on the island had long since accepted that his boat had gone down in a storm, and that the sea had claimed him along with 4 other men from St. Kilda's Mark. She still set a place for him at her table every evening, still left the porchlight burning through the night in case he should find his way home in darkness. The island, Elena came to understand, was full of women who waited. It was as much a part of the place as the lighthouse itself, as the constant wind, as the cry of seabirds and the crash of waves against stone. The men went to sea for work, for adventure, for reasons they carried private and unspoken, and sometimes they didn't come back, and the women they left behind took up their positions at windows and cliff edges and harbor walls, keeping vigil against an absence that stretched from days into weeks, into months, into years, into decades. Why don't they stop? Elena asked her father once, when she was 9 and beginning to understand that waiting could become its own kind of trap. Why don't they accept what happened and move on? Her father had been repairing a fishing net, his hands moving with practiced skill through the pattern of knots and loops. He paused, considering the question with the seriousness it deserved. Because acceptance feels like betrayal, he said finally. Because the moment they stop waiting is the moment they admit that the person they are re-waiting for is truly gone. And for a mother, he glanced toward the kitchen where Elena's mother stood at the sink, staring out at the water. A mother could unstop being a mother just because her child has vanished. The love doesn't stop, so the waiting doesn't stop. It's as simple and as complicated as that. Elena attended the island's small school, taught by Miss Henderson, a mainland woman who had come to St. Kilda's Mark 20 years ago and had somehow never left, despite claiming every autumn that she would return to Edinburgh come spring. There were 11 children in the school, ranging from 5 to 14 years old, and they sat together in one room and learned reading and mathematics and geography, though the geography lessons always felt slightly absurd on an island, where the entire world visible from any vantage point consisted of rock and water, and more rock. Miss Henderson was kind but firm, and she had a way of making even the driest subjects come alive with stories. She spoke of London and Paris and Rome as if she had walked their streets herself, though Elena suspected most of her knowledge came from books rather than experience. Still, her words painted pictures in Elena's mind, opened windows onto a world that existed beyond the narrow confines of the island, a world where people could walk for miles in any direction without encountering the sea, where buildings rose higher than the lighthouse tower, where thousands upon thousands of people lived in close proximity without knowing each other's names. It was both tantalizing and terrifying, this glimpse of elsewhere. Elena found herself drawn to it in her imagination, while simultaneously feeling anchored to St. Kilda's Mark by invisible cables, stronger than any ship's mooring. This was her place, the only place she had ever known. the place where her mother waited and her father tended the light, and the rhythms of life were as predictable as the lunar cycle. The thought of leaving stirred something restless in her chest, but the thought of actually going off, stepping onto a boat, and watching the island shrink behind her felt impossible in a way that went beyond mere difficulty. The years passed, measured out in lighthouse rotations and seasonal storms, in birthdays and holidays, and the endless sameness that defined island existence. Alina grew from child to adolescent to young woman, her body changing in ways that embarrassed and fascinated her, her mind developing complications that made the simple certainties of childhood feel increasingly inadequate. She was 14 when her mother finally spoke about Michael directly. It was evening, and Alina had been reading by lamplight while her mother sat in her customary chair by the window. The silence between them was comfortable. Familiar, they had long since learned to exist in the same space without constant conversation. But then, without preamble, her mother said, "He had your eyes. You know, that same dark brown, like peat water in sunlight." Alina looked up from her book, startled. Her mother, so rarely initiated conversation anymore, had become increasingly interior over the years, as if the act of waiting had hollowed her out and left only a shell animated by habit and hope. "Michael?" Alina asked, though she knew the answer. Her mother nodded, her gaze still fixed on the darkening water. "And your stubborn streak. Once he decided something, there was no talking him out of it. Your father thinks I should have tried harder to keep him from going. But what's a mother to do when her son's already gone in his heart? When he's already sailing those distant waters in his imagination?" She paused, and something that might have been a smile ghosted across her face. "You would have liked him, I think. He was gentle with small creatures, used to nurse injured birds back to health. Had a collection of sea glass he'd gathered from the beach, different colors, each one special to him for reasons I never quite understood." This was the most Alina had ever heard her mother say about Michael, and she sat very still, afraid that any movement might break the spell and send her mother back into silence. "I knew something would happen," her mother continued, her voice taking on a distant quality. "Not the specifics, but the shape of it. I dreamed about it for weeks before he left, water closing over his head, his hand reaching up toward light that grew fainter and fainter. I told him about the dreams, begged him to stay, but he laughed, and said I was being superstitious, said the sight was just island nonsense, said he'd be careful, and he'd come back." Her hands twisted together in her lap. "And maybe he was right. Maybe nothing happened. Maybe he's alive somewhere, living a life that doesn't include us, and I'm waiting for a return that will never come, not because he couldn't, but because he has chosen not to." Alina didn't know what to say to this. The possibility that Michael was alive but had simply abandoned them felt somehow worse than the alternative, more painful than the idea of tragedy or accident. At least death would be an explanation, a reason, a narrative that made sense of the waiting, even if it didn't make it less sad. "Do you think he's dead?" Alina asked carefully. Her mother was quiet for a long time. Outside, the lighthouse beam swept across the water, that steady pulse of light pushing back against the darkness. Finally, she said, "I don't know. And that's the hardest part, Alina, not knowing. Because if I really knew, with certainty, then I could mourn properly. I could bury the hope and move forward with my grief. But as long as there's even the smallest possibility that he might walk up that path one day, might knock on the door with that crooked smile of his and say, 'Sorry, I'm late, Mama,' as long as that possibility exists, I can't stop waiting. I won't stop." Alina felt something shift in her understanding then, a recognition of the impossible position her mother occupied. This wasn't weakness or foolishness or an inability to accept reality. This was a different kind of strength, a refusal to surrender to uncertainty, a determination to keep faith alive in the absence of evidence. It was admirable and tragic in equal measure, and Alina felt her heart break a little for this woman who had given 10 years of her life to the act of waiting, who would give 10 more or 20 more, or however many remained, because the alternative, letting go, was simply unthinkable. The island's rhythms continued, indifferent to human drama. Storms came and went, ships passed in the distance. The lighthouse beam swept its circular path through every night without fail. Alina learned more of her father's trade, mastering the technical aspects of lighthouse keeping, how to trim the lamp's wick for optimal light, how to clean the lens without scratching its delicate surface, how to maintain the clockwork mechanism that required winding every few hours. She learned these skills not because she wanted to be a lighthouse keeper, but because they were there to be learned, because mastery of anything felt like a form of resistance against the entropy that seemed to define so much of island life. She also learned about the waiting from the inside, because at 16 she made the mistake of falling in love. His name was James, and he was the nephew of one of the island families. Visiting for the summer from Glasgow, where his father worked in the shipyards, he was 18, tall and lanky, with hair the color of rust, and a smile that made Elena's stomach do strange flips. They met at a dance held in the community hall, one of the rare social events that broke up the island's routine, and within a week they were inseparable, walking the cliff paths together, sitting on the rocks above the harbor, talking about everything and nothing, stealing kisses in the shadow of the lighthouse, when Elena's father was occupied elsewhere. It was intoxicating, this feeling of being seen and desired, of mattering to someone in a way that felt special and chosen. James spoke of his life in Glasgow, of the noise and the crowds and the opportunities that existed on the mainland, and Elena listened with a hunger she hadn't known she possessed. He also spoke of his plans, how he would finish his apprenticeship in the shipyards, how he would work his way up to master craftsman, how he would eventually have his own business and a house and a life that meant something. "Come with me," he said one evening, as they sat watching the sun set over the water, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that seemed too vivid to be real. "When summer ends, come with me to Glasgow. We could have a life there, Elena, a real life, not this." He gestured vaguely at the island around them, and Elena understood what he meant. Not this waiting, not this stagnation, not this small existence at the edge of the world. The offer thrilled her and terrified her in equal measure. The thought of leaving, of stepping into that vast elsewhere she had only read about in books, called to something deep inside her. But the thought of abandoning her parents, her father, who was growing older and would need help with the lighthouse, her mother, who was already more ghost than woman, who might dissolve entirely if Elena left, felt like a betrayal so profound she couldn't fully articulate it. "I can't," she said finally, and the words tasted like ash in her mouth. James turned to look at her, confusion and disappointment warring in his expression. Why not? How to explain? How to make him understand the invisible chains that bound her to this rock, the sense of obligation that went beyond duty into something older and more primal? "My mother," she began, then stopped, then tried again. "My father, the lighthouse. This is where I'm meant to be." "Says who?" James demanded, and there was an edge to his voice now, frustration breaking through his usual easy charm. "Says some idea about fate or destiny that you've been fed your whole life. Elena, you're not your mother. You don't have to wait at windows for something that's never coming. You could have a different life." "I know that," Elena said, though she wasn't entirely sure she did. "But I also know that if I leave, I'll spend the rest of my life feeling like I abandoned them, like I chose my own happiness over their need, and I don't think I could live with that." They argued, of course, or rather, James argued, while Elena held her position with a quiet stubbornness that mirrored her mother's. When summer ended, James returned to Glasgow with promises to write, promises to come back, promises that felt sincere in the moment, but that Elena suspected would dissolve like mist once he was back in his real life, once the island became a memory rather than a present reality. And she was right. The letters came for a few months, growing progressively shorter and less frequent, until finally they stopped altogether. Elena was not surprised, though she was hurt in a distant way, as if the pain were happening to someone else and she was simply observing it from a remove. She understood now, with painful clarity, what her mother had meant about waiting, because she found herself scanning the harbor each time a supply boat arrived, hoping against reason that James might be aboard, that he might have changed his mind, that he might have come back for her. She didn't wait long, only a few months, before she recognized the pattern and deliberately broke it. She forced herself to stop looking for the boats, to stop expecting his arrival. It required effort, a conscious decision renewed daily, but she managed it, and in managing it, she began to understand the difference between her situation and her mother's. James had been a summer romance, sweet and brief, and ultimately inconsequential. Michael had been her mother's son, bone of her bone, a love that predated memory and would outlast hope. You could choose to stop waiting for a sweetheart, but a child, that was a different kind of waiting entirely, one that wasn't subject to choice or will. The years continued their steady march. Elena's father's hair went from grey to white. His hands developed a tremor that made the delicate work of maintaining the lighthouse increasingly difficult. He taught Elena everything he knew, preparing her to take over the responsibility even though the lighthouse service had never approved a female keeper before. "We'll deal with that when the time comes," he said. "For now, just learn." Her mother's waiting, meanwhile, had calcified into something almost ritualistic. She had specific times and places for her vigil: morning at the kitchen window, afternoon on the cliff path, evening on the harbor wall. She moved between these stations with the precision of someone following a sacred schedule, and Alina noticed that the other waiting women of the island did the same. They had their own patterns, their own routines, their own ways of structuring the endless uncertainty. Alina was 23 when her father died. It was not dramatic or unexpected. He was 68. His heart had been weak for years, and one night he simply didn't wake up. Alina found him in the morning, lying peacefully in the bed he had shared with her mother for 30 years. His face relaxed in a way it never quite was during his waking hours. She stood looking down at him for a long moment, feeling a complicated grief that mixed sorrow with relief that his struggles were over, that he wouldn't have to face the indignity of no longer being able to perform the work that had defined his life. Her mother took the news with a strange calm, as if she had been expecting it. "He held on as long as he could," she said quietly. "Wanted to make sure you were ready to take over the lighthouse. Now he can rest." She touched Elena's face with a gentleness that had been absent for years. "You'll need to contact the lighthouse service. They'll want to send someone from the mainland." The funeral was held 3 days later, attended by everyone on the island, all 37 families, turning out to pay their respects to a man who had kept the light burning for 4 decades, who had guided countless ships safely past the dangerous rocks that surrounded St. Kilda's Mark. They buried him in the small cemetery on the island's south slope, where generations of islanders lay beneath simple stone markers, their names worn smooth by wind and weather. After the funeral, Alina did what needed to be done. She wrote to the lighthouse service, informing them of her father's death, and formally requesting to be appointed as his replacement. She knew it was a long shot. The service had never appointed a woman to a lighthouse posting, viewed the work as too dangerous and too demanding for female constitution. But Alina also knew she was the most qualified person available, knew the lighthouse better than anyone alive, and she was prepared to fight for the position. The response came 6 weeks later, and it was more positive than she had dared hope. The lighthouse service acknowledged her qualifications and, given the lighthouse's remote location and the difficulty of finding someone willing to relocate to St. Kilda's Mark, agreed to appoint her on a provisional basis. She would serve for 1 year, during which time they would evaluate her performance. If she proved capable, the position would become permanent. Alina felt a fierce satisfaction as she read the letter. She was going to be the first female lighthouse keeper in the service's history, at least in any official capacity. It was a small victory in the grand scheme of things, but it was hers, and it mattered. She took up her duties with a seriousness that bordered on obsession. Each evening at dusk, she climbed the spiral stairs to light the lamp. Each morning at dawn, she extinguished it. She maintained the lens, wound the clockwork, kept meticulous logs of weather conditions and passing ships. She repaired what needed repairing, painted what needed painting, imposed her will on the physical structure of the lighthouse through sheer determination and stubborn persistence, and her mother continued to wait. If anything, the waiting intensified after her father's death, as if she had been holding something back while he was alive and could now fully surrender to the vigil. She spent whole days at her various stations, barely eating, barely sleeping, her eyes fixed on the horizon with an intensity that seemed to burn through the very air. Alina tried to care for her, bringing her food and blankets, guiding her back inside when the weather turned dangerous. But her mother had receded so far into her waiting that she was barely present, even when you stood directly in front of her. The other women of the island noticed, of course. They began stopping by the cottage with increasing frequency, ostensibly to check on Alina, but really to observe her mother, to compare her waiting with their own. Mrs. Calloway came one afternoon and stood beside Elena's mother at the window, the two of them staring out at the water in companionable silence, a communion of absence, a shared understanding that needed no words. "How long has it been for you?" Elena asked Mrs. Calloway, bringing her tea that she knew wouldn't be drunk. 14 years, the older woman said. 14 years since Thomas left for the mainland. People tell me I should accept he's not coming back, that he's probably dead, or started a new life somewhere. But I can't, won't. As long as there's breath in my body, I'll watch for him. It's just what you do when you love someone. You don't give up, just because time passes or the odds are bad. You keep faith. Alina understood this logic even as she wanted to argue against it. There was something both noble and futile about this kind of faithfulness, this refusal to accept what seemed obvious to everyone else. It was a form of love, yes, but it was also a form of prison, and Alina could unshake the feeling that these women, her mother included, were serving life sentences for crimes they had uncommitted. She was 26 when the ship arrived. It was late autumn, the season when storms swept in from the Atlantic with particular fury, when the lighthouse's beams seemed to struggle against darkness that pressed close and hungry. Alina was in the kitchen preparing dinner when she heard the fog horn, a deep, mournful sound that echoed across the water. Ships didn't usually approach the island in such weather, found it safer to give St. Kilda's Mark a wide berth until conditions improved. She went to the window and saw a vessel in the harbor, a medium-sized cargo ship with running lights that glowed through the mist. Even as she watched, a small boat was being lowered, 3 figures climbing down to it. They were coming ashore. Alina grabbed her coat and headed out, making her way down the steep path to the harbor. By the time she arrived, the small boat had reached the dock, and the 3 men were tying it off. They looked up as she approached, and one of them, tall, bearded, with eyes that held a weariness so profound it seemed to have its own weight, stepped forward. "Is this St. Kilda's Mark?" he asked, his voice rough from disuse or emotion. "It is," Alina confirmed. "I'm Alina Morrison, the lighthouse keeper. Can I help you?" The man seemed to struggle with something, his mouth working silently for a moment before words emerged. I used to live here, a long time ago. I'm looking for the Morrison family. Do they still?" Alina felt something cold settle in her stomach. She studied the man more carefully. His age was hard to determine, somewhere between 40 and 50, his face weathered by sun and sea and time. But there was something familiar in the set of his features, something that nagged at her memory. "The Morrison family," she said slowly. "What's your connection to them?" "I'm their son," the man said, and his voice broke on the word. "I'm Michael Morrison. I've come home." The world seemed to tilt sideways. Alina stared at this stranger who claimed to be her brother, this man who had been gone for 27 years, whose absence had shaped her entire life, whose return her mother had waited for with a faith that defied all reason. She should have felt joy, or relief, or vindication of her mother's long vigil. Instead, she felt a cold anger building in her chest. "You're Michael," she repeated flatly. He nodded, and she could see that he was crying now, tears cutting tracks through the grime on his face. "I know it's been a long time. I know I should have written, should have come back sooner. I have reasons, explanations, not good ones, maybe, but reasons. Is my mother, is she still?" "She's alive," Alina said, and the words came out harder than she intended. "She's been alive for 27 years, standing at windows and walking cliff paths and waiting for you to come home. Every day, Michael. Every single day for 27 years, she's been waiting." Michael flinched as if she'd struck him. "I want to see her, please. I need to see her." Alina wanted to refuse, wanted to punish him for the years of pain he'd caused, for the way his absence had hollowed out their mother and stolen their father's peace. But she also knew that this moment, this impossible long-awaited moment, belonged to her mother, not to her. Whatever anger Alina felt, whatever judgment she wanted to render, had to wait. "Follow me," she said coldly. They climbed the path to the cottage in silence. Michael and his 2 companions, crew members from his ship, Alina assumed, following her through the gathering darkness. The lighthouse beam swept overhead, its rhythm as steady and reliable as a heartbeat, a metronome marking time that had passed too slowly for those who waited and too quickly for those who had forgotten to count. Her mother was in her usual place by the kitchen window when they entered. She didn't turn at the sound of the door, didn't acknowledge their presence at all. As always, in her vigil, Alina stood back, suddenly uncertain, and watched as Michael approached slowly, as if walking towards something that might shatter if he moved too quickly. "Mama," he said softly. Her mother went absolutely still, every muscle in her body locking. For a long moment, she didn't move, didn't breathe, didn't respond at all. Then, with agonizing slowness, she turned from the window and looked at the man standing in her kitchen. Alina saw the progression of emotions that crossed her mother's face: confusion, disbelief, recognition, hope, joy, each one flickering by in rapid succession until they all collapsed into something too large and complex to be named. Her mother's hand came up to her mouth, and a sound emerged from her, not quite a word, not quite a cry, something more primal than either. "Michael," she whispered. "Is it really you?" "It's me, Mama," he said, and his voice was thick with tears. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. I should have come back sooner. I should have written. I should have, but he didn't get to finish the sentence because his mother crossed the space between them in 3 swift steps and pulled him into an embrace so fierce it seemed she might never let go. She was sobbing now, great heaving sobs that shook her entire frame, and Michael was holding her just as tightly, the two of them clinging to each other like survivors of a shipwreck. Alina watched from the doorway, feeling like an intruder in this moment of reunion. She should have been happy, should have felt relief that her mother's faith had been vindicated, that the waiting had finally ended. But instead, she felt that cold anger growing stronger, spreading through her like frost. 27 years. 27 years of waiting, of hope deferred, of a mother slowly disappearing into absence. And now he simply walked back in, offered tears and apologies, and expected to be forgiven, expected everything to be magically restored, because he had finally deigned to return. Her mother eventually released him, holding him at arm's length so she could look at him properly. "You're so different," she said wonderingly. "But I knew you. The moment you spoke, I knew your voice. My boy, my Michael." She touched his face with trembling fingers, as if confirming he was real. "Where have you been? What happened to you?" Michael's expression was complicated shame and regret, and something else Alina couldn't quite identify. "It's a long story, Mama. Not a good one, not one I'm proud of. But I want to tell you, I want to explain everything. I need to sit down first. The journey here was difficult, and I'm not as young as I used to be." They moved into the sitting room, and Alina made tea with mechanical efficiency, while Michael began his story. His companions had stayed outside, giving the family privacy, and Alina was grateful for that at least. This was going to be painful enough without strangers witnessing it. Michael's tale, when it came out, was exactly as unheroic as Alina had suspected. He had gone to sea, as planned, and had initially loved the adventure, the distant ports, the sense of seeing the world beyond the confining boundaries of island life. He had meant to write, had composed letters in his head dozens of times, but had always found reasons not to actually send them. It was easier to keep moving forward than to look back, easier to let the ties to home loosen and fray than to maintain them across the distance. Then, in a port in the Caribbean, he had met a woman, had fallen in love, or what he thought was love at 23, had decided to jump ship and stay with her, abandoning his post and his responsibilities. The woman had eventually left him, but by then he was stranded and broke, too ashamed to reach out to his family, too proud to admit he had failed. So he had drifted, working odd jobs, signing on to different ships, moving from port to port, with no real purpose or direction. Years passed, he aged, the shame deepened until it became a thing he couldn't acknowledge, could barely even think about. He convinced himself his family had forgotten him, had moved on, that there was no point in returning after so long. He built a life of sorts, not a good life, not one he was proud of, but a life nonetheless. He remarried eventually, to a woman who knew nothing of his history, and they had children, and then his second wife died in childbirth, and the child with her, and Michael found himself alone and hollowed out at 45, with nothing to show for 27 years but regrets and a body worn down by hard living. That's when he finally decided to come back, to face what he had run from, to see if anything could be salvaged from the wreckage he had made. "I know it's not enough," he said when he finished, his voice barely above a whisper. "I know, sorry doesn't cover it, doesn't even come close. I abandoned you. I let you think I was dead or lost, when really I was just too much of a coward to face what I'd done. But I had to come back. I had to see you one more time, had to try to make some kind of amends before it's too late." Elena's mother had listened to all of this with an expression that was hard to read. Now she reached out and took Michael's hand, holding it between both of hers. "You're here now," she said simply. "That's what matters. You came back. My waiting wasn't for nothing." And that was when Elena's anger finally found its voice. "Wasn't for nothing," she said, her tone sharp enough to make both Michael and their mother look up in surprise. "Mama, he abandoned us. He didn't write, didn't send word, didn't care enough to let you know he was alive. You spent 27 years, half your life, waiting for him, and it was for nothing, because he wasn't lost at sea. He wasn't dead. He was just too selfish to think about anyone but himself." Her mother's face hardened. "Alina, no." Alina interrupted. "No, you need to hear this. Both of you need to hear this. Do you have any idea what those years were like, watching you disappear into waiting? Watching you become a ghost in your own house? Dad held on as long as he could, but your absence wore him down. made him old before his time. And me, I grew up with a mother who was barely present, who cared more about a son who was gone than a daughter who was right there. That's not fair, her mother said, but her voice lacked conviction. Isn't it? Alina demanded. She turned to Michael. And you had children with another woman. You built a life somewhere else. You made choices, had opportunities, lived your life on your terms. And all the while, the woman who gave birth to you, who loved you with everything she had, stood at windows and searched horizons and waited for a return you never intended to make, until you lost everything and decided to come back, not because you cared about her, but because you had nowhere else to go. Michael was crying again, and Alina felt a mean satisfaction at having hurt him. She knew she was being cruel, knew she should probably stop, but the words kept coming, propelled by years of accumulated frustration and resentment. You want absolution, she said. You want to be told that it's okay, that all is forgiven, that you can slide back into being the beloved son as if nothing happened. But it's not okay. It will never be okay. You stole 27 years from her. You can't give those back. You can't undo that damage. And the fact that she's willing to forgive you, willing to accept any scrap of you she can get, doesn't make what you did any less terrible. It just makes her pain more obvious. The silence that followed was absolute. Alina's mother was staring at her with an expression of shock and hurt, and Michael looked like he wanted the floor to open up and swallow him. Alina felt her own eyes burning with tears, felt her hands shaking with the force of emotion she had kept locked away for so long. I'm sorry, she said finally, though she wasn't sure she meant it. I'm sorry for saying all that, but someone needed to. Someone needed to acknowledge that waiting has a cost, that faith can be a trap, that love doesn't always heal the wounds that neglect creates. She turned and walked out of the cottage, into the cold evening air. Above her the lighthouse beam swept across the sky, and she climbed toward it, as she had climbed toward it every evening for 3 years, seeking in its steady light some reassurance that at least some things in this world remained constant, remained reliable, remained true. The lighthouse, at least, would never abandon her. The lighthouse would never leave and forget to write. The lighthouse simply stood and shone, performing its function without complaint or compromise. And in that moment, Alina felt more kinship with the structure than with the human beings she had left behind in the cottage below. She stayed in the lighthouse tower for hours, tending the lamp, watching the night deepen around her. Below, she could see lights in the cottage windows, could imagine the conversations happening there, her mother and Michael catching up on lost years, building bridges across the chasm that separated them. Part of her wanted to go back down, to be part of that reunion, to allow herself to be happy that her mother's waiting had finally ended. But a larger part of her remained angry, unable to simply let go of the damage that had been done. Alina accepted the compliment with grace, though part of her remained wary of Michael's approval. They had developed a workable relationship over the years, something that wasn't quite closeness but wasn't hostile either. She had learned to accept him as he was someone who tried, but who would probably never be fully present in the way their mother needed, in the way Alina thought family should be. He kept his promises now, which was an improvement, but the promises themselves were modest visits, letters, small gestures, rather than the kind of deep, sustained commitment that characterized Alina's own approach to relationships. Their mother, for her part, seemed content with what she had. Michael's periodic visits were enough for her, breaks in the routine that she could look forward to and plan around. And between those visits, she had reclaimed her life working in her garden, helping with the lighthouse, maintaining friendships with the other women on the island, building a present that wasn't entirely dominated by longing for a different past. Alina was 35 when Mrs. Calloway died. It was not unexpected. She was 83, had been frail for years, but her death felt significant in a way that went beyond the personal. She had been waiting for 26 years when she finally closed her eyes for the last time, still positioned in her chair by the window, still oriented toward the harbor where she had watched and hoped for more than a quarter century. Her husband never came back, never sent word, never provided the closure that might have allowed her to stop waiting and start grieving properly. And now she was gone, and her vigil had ended, not with resolution, but simply with cessation. The funeral was well attended, and Alina gave a eulogy that tried to capture the dignity and devotion of Mrs. Calloway's long waiting. But afterward, standing in the cemetery where generations of islanders lay buried, Alina felt a deep sadness that went beyond mourning one elderly woman's death. She was grieving for all the waiting that had come to nothing, for all the faith that had never been rewarded, for all the years spent scanning horizons for ships that never came. It wasn't wasted, her mother said quietly, standing beside her among the gravestones, her waiting. It might look that way from outside, but it wasn't. She loved, Thomas really loved him, and waiting was how she expressed that love. It gave her life structure and meaning. It connected her to something larger than just her own survival. Was it painful? Yes. Would it have been better if he had come back? Of course. But the waiting itself wasn't meaningless just because it didn't produce the outcome she hoped for. Alina wanted to argue, wanted to insist that 26 years was too high a price to pay for the expression of love, that there should have been some other way for Mrs. Calloway to maintain her connection to her husband without sacrificing so much of her own life. But she also knew her mother was right, in a way that was both true and troubling. The waiting had meant something to Mrs. Calloway. It had been her choice. However constrained that choice might have been by circumstance and emotion and social expectation. To dismiss it as wasted was to dishonor her, to reduce her life to a simple narrative of delusion and loss. So Alina said nothing, just stood with her mother among the dead, thinking about all the complicated ways that human beings managed love and loss, and the spaces in between. She was 40 when her mother's health began to fail. It started subtly increased fatigue, occasional confusion, a tremor in her hands that gradually worsened. The island's doctor made the journey from the mainland twice a year, and during one of these visits, he examined Elena's mother carefully and delivered a diagnosis that was both expected and devastating. Progressive neurological deterioration, probably Parkinson's disease, though he couldn't be certain without tests that weren't available on the island. The prognosis was gradual decline over months or years. She would lose more and more function, until eventually she would need constant care. Alina received this news with outward calm and inner terror. Her mother had finally reclaimed her life, had finally moved beyond waiting into living, and now this a different kind of loss, slower and more certain than Michael's long absence had been. There was a terrible irony to it, and Alina felt anger at the universe or God or whatever force governed human affairs, anger at the unfairness of giving her mother just a few good years before taking them away again. But anger didn't change anything. So Alina did what she always did. She made plans, adjusted routines, figured out how to manage. She hired a woman from the village to help with care during the day, learned to handle the medical aspects of her mother's condition, made the cottage accessible for someone with increasing mobility challenges, and she continued her lighthouse duties, because the light still needed to be maintained. Ships still needed to be guided, and the world didn't stop turning just because your personal world was falling apart. Michael came more frequently now, his visits extending longer. He had retired from active sea duty, was working in a shipyard office on the mainland, and he could arrange his schedule to spend weeks at a time on the island. Alina was grateful for his help, though she remained watchful, still not entirely trusting that he wouldn't disappear when things got too difficult. But he didn't disappear. He stayed. And he helped, and he proved finally, almost too late, that he was capable of being present in the way that mattered. He fed their mother when she could no longer manage a spoon, read to her when her eyes grew too weak for books, sat with her through the long nights when pain made sleep impossible. "I'm sorry," he said to Alina one evening, both of them exhausted after a particularly difficult day. "Sorry that I wasn't here for so many years. Sorry that I'm only learning how to be a good son now, when it's almost too late." "You're here now," Alina said, echoing their mother's words from years before. "That's what matters." And she meant it, mostly. The past couldn't be changed, and holding on to anger at this point felt like a burden she no longer wanted to carry. Michael had caused tremendous pain, yes, but he had also returned, had kept his promises, had become, if not the son their mother had waited for, at least a version of that son, who was trying his best with the person he had become. Their mother died on a clear autumn morning, with both her children beside her. She had been declining for weeks, slipping in and out of consciousness, her body slowly shutting down as the disease progressed. Alina had been keeping vigil, not waiting for her to return from somewhere, but simply being present for her departure, which was its own kind of witnessing, its own form of love. In her final hours, she was lucid, more present than she had been in days. She looked at Michael and smiled. "You came back," she said softly. "My boy came back." "I did, Mama," he said, crying. "I came back." She turned her attention to Alina then. "And you stayed, my steady girl, my lighthouse keeper. You stayed and kept the light burning." She reached out with a trembling hand, and Alina took it, feeling the fragility of bones beneath paper-thin skin. Don't wait too long, Alina. Don't spend your life at windows. Promise me." "I promise," Alina whispered, though she wasn't entirely sure what she was promising. Her mother's eyes drifted closed then, her breathing growing shallow and irregular. Alina and Michael sat with her, one on each side of the bed, holding her hands as she made her final journey, not out to sea, not towards some distant horizon, but inward, down into darkness, and then, perhaps, into whatever lay beyond. She died peacefully, without struggle or distress, and Alina felt a complicated mixture of grief and relief. Grief for the loss of her mother, for the end of a relationship that had defined so much of her life. Relief that the suffering was over, that her mother was finally free of both the physical pain of her illness and the emotional pain of her long years of waiting. They buried her next to Elena's father in the island cemetery, and the entire community turned out for the service. Alina spoke about her mother's strength, her faith, her refusal to give up hope even when hope seemed unreasonable. She spoke about the cost of waiting and the value of it, about the way her mother had finally, in the end, found peace, not through her son's return, but through her own decision to stop being defined entirely by his absence. After the funeral, as people dispersed back to their homes, Alina walked up to the lighthouse. It was late afternoon, and soon she would need to light the lamp, would need to set the mechanism in motion that would send light sweeping across the darkening water. But for now, she stood at the base of the tower, looking out at the sea that had been her constant companion for all her 40 years. Michael joined her, standing silently beside his sister. They didn't speak for a long time, just watched the waves and the sky and the light changing as the sun moved toward the horizon. "What will you do now?" Michael asked finally. It was a good question, one Alina had been asking herself. With both parents gone, she was free to leave the island if she wanted. Her book's success meant she could probably support herself as a writer, could move to Edinburgh or London or anywhere she chose. She could step onto a boat and not look back, could finally see the world she had read about for so long in books. But even as she considered these possibilities, Alina knew she wouldn't take them. Not because she was trapped or afraid, but because this was where she belonged. The lighthouse needed a keeper. The island needed people willing to stay, to maintain the infrastructure and community that allowed life to persist in this harsh place. And she needed the lighthouse, needed the steady rhythm of its operation, needed the sense of purpose that came from guiding ships safely through dangerous waters. "I'll stay," she said simply. "I'll keep the light." Michael nodded, understanding. "You're always the steady one," he said. "The one who knew who she was and what mattered. I used to think that made you boring, limited, but I was wrong. It makes you strong. It makes you someone the world can count on." They stood together as the sun set, as the sky turned from blue to orange to purple to black. And when it was fully dark, Alina climbed the spiral stairs to light the lamp, performing the ritual she had performed countless times before, and would perform countless times again. The light came on, bright and steady, cutting through the darkness with mechanical precision. It swept across the water in its eternal circle, marking time, marking space, marking the boundary between safety and danger. And Alina stood beside it, this woman who had chosen to stay when she could have left, who had chosen duty and commitment and reliability over adventure and change and the seductive possibilities of elsewhere. Below, the island settled into its nighttime routines. Women who were still waiting took up their evening positions, scanning the horizon one more time before sleep. Men who had stayed tended fires and secured gates and did all the small tasks that maintained households in marginal places. Children dreamed of futures that might be different from their parents' lives, or might simply be continuations of the same patterns, the same choices, the same balance between staying and going. And in the lighthouse, Alina stood watch, as her father had before her, as his father had before him. She was the keeper of the light, the marker of the boundary, the one who stayed. And in that staying, in that commitment to presence and reliability, and the unglamorous work of showing up day after day, she found a kind of meaning that was deeper and more durable than the excitement of distant horizons or the romance of endless searching. Her mother had waited for 27 years for Michael to return. Mrs. Calloway had waited for 26 years for her husband. Mary Duncan had waited 15 years for her sweetheart. All those years, all that faith, all that patient endurance of absence and uncertainty. And Elena wasn't waiting. She was present. She was here, in this moment, in this place, doing this work. Not because she was trapped, or limited, or lacking in imagination, But because she had chosen this, had decided that there was value in being the person who stayed, the one who kept the light burning, the one who could be counted on to be exactly where she said she would be. The light swept round, endless and unchanging. The sea stretched to the horizon, dark and deep and full of mysteries. And Elena stood between them, between light and darkness, between land and water, between what was known and what remained forever unknowable land. She kept her vigil, not as a waiting woman, but as a woman who had finally understood the difference between waiting for life to begin and actively choosing the life you had. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying with it the salt smell of the ocean and the cries of nightbirds. Inside the lighthouse, the clockwork ticked its steady rhythm, marking time that moved forward inexorably, that could never be recovered or rewound, that could only be lived in the present moment or lost forever to regret and longing. Elena placed her hand on the lens housing, feeling the heat from the lamp, feeling the subtle vibration of the rotating mechanism. This was her inheritance, not just the lighthouse itself, but the understanding that had come from watching her mother wait, and her brother leave, and all the other island residents navigate their own relationships to staying and going, to presence and absence, to the eternal question of where and how and with whom we choose to live our lives. The light swept on, as it would sweep on long after Elena was gone, long after everyone now living had died and been replaced by new generations who would face their own versions of these same eternal questions. But for now, in this moment, Elena was here. She was the keeper. She was the one who stayed. And in that simple act of staying, of being reliably present, she had found something more valuable than all the adventures she might have had elsewhere. She had found herself, and she had found peace, and she had found a way to love without losing herself, to waiting without becoming a ghost in her own life. The night deepened. The light continued its sweep. And Elena stood watch over the dark waters, over the sleeping island, over all the people who waited, and all the people who stayed, and all the people who went searching for something they might never find. She was 40 years old, and she was exactly where she needed to be, doing exactly what she was meant to do. And in the morning, when dawn broke over the horizon, and the light was no longer needed, she would extinguish it with the same care she used to light it. And then she would begin again another day, another cycle, another small victory in the ongoing work of keeping the light burning against the darkness. This was her life. This was her choice, and she would not wait for it to become something else. She would live it, fully and completely, in each moment as it came, because that, finally, was the answer to her mother's long years of waiting, not to stop hoping or caring or loving, but to do those things while still remaining fully alive in the present, still capable of joy and growth, and the daily satisfactions that came from work well done and commitments kept. The lighthouse stood, the light burned, and Elena kept watch, neither waiting for something to come, nor running from something left behind, but simply being present, purposeful, and finally, fully herself.